Tonight on Year-to-Date Constitutional Reforms discussed in the Senate, not again.
I put J-Fence in a force field of my own.
And Rachel Monin checks in with Leah Bomberg.
May the force be with you. Year-to-Date starts now.
This afternoon, the Committee on Rules and Privileges heard a bill to amend the Constitution. If passed by the full Senate, it would have brought many reforms to referendum for the students to vote on. It was tabled this afternoon after calls were made by various senators that we do not need a new Constitution, but only a couple of amendments. Is the Senate squandering its time again, or are there problems that desperately need to be fixed? With more on this tonight, I will be talking with Senators Ben Schorr and Justin Broubalow and Mr. Peter Wahlberg. Thanks for joining us. Mr. Wahlberg, let's start with you because you've been working on this for a long time now. Do we need a constitutional reform?
Absolutely, and that's why I'm hopeful that the Senate the Committee on Rules and Privileges decided to table the Constitution rather than take any other course with it. Because the broad consensus of the senators who have spoken to me seems to be that the new reforms that we've put through, such as an elected leader for the Senate and more accountability in the executives and the class councils, are things that are common sense reforms. It was just the timing that had some people put off. So I hope we can work that out.
Senator Schorr, do we need changes?
I liked a lot of the changes that were put through in the new Constitution. There were a couple things that I was waiting for the Constitution to come to the floor for, like the Senate keeping the budget, a couple of other things, as well as the Judicial Board trying. I wasn't really in agreement with that entire thing, but trying to change that in committee would have been silly, and so I just wanted to either take that out and things like that. There are things that need reform, and I can't wait for it to come back next fall. It's something that needs to happen, but the timing was the real issue.
Okay. Senator Broubalow, what do you think students are saying about this? I mean, just people who randomly heard, oh, the Senate's working on another, not another bylaw change, but they're reforming itself again and again and again. What do you think students are saying about that, and what would you say to them?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think a vast majority of the students really know about it because things were kind of hurried at the end, and I think that's the reason a lot of senators were against putting up for referendum this spring. The ones that I have that do know about it are in fact kind of cynical about the SG changing its shape, trying to change its shape once again. I think what I would say to them is, you're right. I'm in favor of a lot of the things that is in the draft Constitution, but I'm against a sweeping reform. I'm more in favor of a gradual reform rather than uprooting the whole thing.
Mr. Wahlberg, as I said before, you've been working on this for, what, about a year now?
Yes, personally.
Okay. What would you say to students who say that this is just a waste of time, since you have been working on this extensively for such a long time? Even when you were in the Senate, you were big bylaw changes and all sorts of stuff. What is the need for so many changes and for the Senate to spend so much time on it?
The need is simple. It's always been my belief that the interest of students is not how the SG sets itself up, but what the SG accomplishes, what it does, what the effect is. And I think, and I believe, that with this new Constitution, you would have a much more efficient student government. And given that fact, I believe that students would respond favorably to these reforms after an effective campaign of educating them about it. It's not a matter of the SG sort of taking on chameleon tactics, changing its shape to distract people from what it's doing. It's a matter of making it more effective and responsive so that it will be better for years into the future, not just this year.
Do you think that's true by creating somewhat of a bigger bureaucracy? I mean, you want to create it somewhat, it's called a coordinator or a controller or something, which is pretty much like a prime minister, if I'm right. Would there be more clashing between the executive and than the legislative branches if that happened?
Not at all, and it's not even a matter of more bureaucracy. The Senate is an institution, and this is true of when I served in it and in the present day. The Senate is capable of great individual initiative on the part of its members, but it has trouble working as a whole. This is part of an initiative to give political leadership to the Senate so it can be more effective as a whole, not only vis-a-vis the executive, not only with them, but towards the administration and in its policy making. So it's not a matter of more bureaucracy, it's a matter of a more effective structure.
Mm-hmm. Senator Schorr, you talked how you thought that there were some changes that needed to be made. Is there anything specifically that you agreed with?
Well, this year, I mean, as Peter talked about, it's not the way that the SG is constituted, but what it does. And so this year, the prime example for me that I went on throughout the entire time was how class councils were effective or how they were ineffective and squandered a lot of their resources. So I think what I saw in the new Constitution was a great way for the SG to be more effective and get by on still being as democratic as it was and inclusive, but also even trying to be more inclusive in the new Constitution. I think that what Peter proposed in having the comptroller and the secretary not elected but appointed by showing statistics of people being more involved that way through an appointment process only makes it more inclusive. And so I was looking at the inclusiveness and the effectiveness that was brought out by the document. There are still some troubles in there, but it's necessary because Peter talked about a couple years ago how student activities forced us to create this Constitution. I didn't know that, but really I saw problems with the current Constitution as it is. And so with Peter and the committee's work, I think that there were a lot of things that happened with that were effective.
Senator Broubalow, your thoughts on some of the changes?
Well, like I said, I do think a lot of it is necessary. For one, just to echo Mr. Schorr, that the fact that the Secretary and the Comptroller will be appointed for both the SG executive as well as the class councils. I think they require technical skills that a lot of people who would normally run for office don't, that they don't have. And so I think that's a better way to get a more effective executive. And I'm also in favor of putting all policy decisions underneath the president. The way that it's structured now is kind of an antiquated structure that no longer has any bearing. And I think the president and the vice president should be both focused on their own separate roles rather than intermingling the two. One thing I am very much against is the position of the controller for the Senate. I think that puts too much power in one person's hands, and that's just a philosophical difference with Mr. Wahlberg, I think. And I wouldn't expect him to amend or to change that or compromise his own beliefs. It's just something that I'm against personally.
Want to respond to that?
For one thing, it is called the coordinator, and I think that's not just a semantic distinction. This is not a person who is supposed to exercise control over the Senate and its activities. It's a person who is supposed to help harness the energies of individual members of the Senate who otherwise might want to be doing things but might not have the direction or the knowledge sufficient to do them. And I think that's really why it's a key reform. To me, it is the key part of the reform package. Is to give the Senate that kind of direction to make it a relevant force. Look, a lot of the problems we've been seeing with the Senate's activities is that the Senate analyzes and fixes on a problem, and then the president just goes off and handles it with their own policy making while the Senate's still debating it. And this way it would make the Senate much quicker and much more responsive. So I can understand the concerns with concentrating power in the Senate, but I really think it would be a positive development, and I think there would be much more gained.
Senator Schorr, your last thoughts?
Well, my last thoughts are that I wanted publicity about this, and I wanted people to be involved. And the reforms that I was looking forward on the floor rather of the Senate are going to wait until next year, obviously, when it comes by. So we'll see when it happens how many people we get involved. If we have 20 people get involved in this, I'll shoot it down next year. But if we have a lot of people get involved, I think everybody should be behind this. It's great reform for us.
Your last thoughts, Senator Broubalow?
I think reform is necessary to a certain extent, but I don't think that we should be creating as widespread of a reform as the draft Constitution creates, and so I think we need to take a look at that in the fall.
Well, Mr. Wahlberg, Senator Schorr, Senator Broubalow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
When we come back, Jason sits down with Sports Zone panelist Justin Fensterman. Don't change the channel. We'll be right back after this. Thanks.
Coordinator. Too many C words. Comptroller, controller,
I
coordinator.
hate the name coordinator. We kept trying to find a replacement.